Hi, welcome back to another episode of The True Crime Dish. Today we're going to be making some gingerdoodle cookies, which are basically gingerbread cookies, but you roll them in cinnamon sugar like you would a snickerdoodle cookie. And then we are also going to be discussing Casey Anthony today. On August 9th, 2005, Casey Anthony is giving birth to her baby girl, Kaylee Marie Anthony. When Casey found out she was pregnant at just 18 years old, she was terrified of telling her parents, but her mom, Cindy Anthony, was absolutely ecstatic that she was going to be a grandmother. Casey wasn't sure who the father was, and she knew she could not do this all alone, so she ended up leaning on her parents a lot for support during that time, and her parents happily obliged. They had no problem with this at all. Cindy and Casey had a very close relationship while Casey was growing up. Cindy referred to Casey as the light of her life, and that light was passed on to Kaylee once she was born. With happy hearts on that day in August 2005, no one could have ever predicted that little Kaylee would not even make it to see her third birthday. Casey Anthony was a normal girl growing up. As I mentioned, she and her mother had a very close relationship. They did everything together. Cindy was a registered nurse, and George Anthony, Casey's father, worked in law enforcement. Just a pretty average family. Casey was remembered as a popular girl with a lot of friends growing up, but some of her high school friends recalled Casey being caught in lies fairly often. In fact, as Casey's high school graduation approached, her parents and her grandparents show up to the ceremony expecting to see Casey walk the stage with her class because that's what she had told them. And they get there only to find out that Casey was actually several credits short from graduating, and she would not be walking the stage that day, despite Casey telling them that she would be. Casey hadn't even been going to her classes in the weeks before graduation. And this seemed to be just the beginning of Casey's lies. In mid-June 2008, Casey allegedly gets into an argument with her parents and leaves with Kaylee. It would be weeks before George and Cindy hear from Casey again. It's not until July 13th, 2008, when Casey's parents get a letter from an impound lot stating that their vehicle has been impounded and that they need to come get it. This vehicle did belong to Cindy and George, but they were letting Casey use it. So they were like, okay, what's going on? Why is her car being towed? And we haven't heard from her in weeks. Cindy and George go pick up the vehicle, and as soon as they open it up, they notice a horrible odor, as well as Kaylee's car is still in the backseat and all of her toys are in there, and they have just had enough at this point. They haven't seen Kaylee in nearly a month, so they track Casey down. They find her at her boyfriend's house without Kaylee and basically force her to come back home with them. After arguing for quite some time, they're getting zero answers about where Kaylee is. Cindy actually calls the police and she reports Kaylee missing and also mentions that strange odor in the car. Cindy said, quote unquote, "It smelled like a damn dead body in there." That's what we call a red flag, Cindy. The police arrive and separate the family per routine, trying to get any kind of story out of Casey about where this missing 2-year-old is. Casey tells the police that she left Kaylee with Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, who was Kaylee's nanny. She is often referred to as Zanny the nanny. So Casey states that she left Kaylee with Zanny the nanny 31 days ago and has not seen or heard from Kaylee since. Obviously, their first question is, okay, if you have not seen your daughter in 31 days, why have you not reported her missing? Because Casey wasn't even the one that reported her missing, it was Cindy. Casey explained that she just was worried that something would happen to Kaylee if she reported her missing. She was just simply scared, so she didn't say anything. The police were like, okay, that's weird, but can you show us where this Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez lives? Casey says, yeah, for sure, I'll show you where she lives. So they pile in the police car. Casey guides them to an apartment complex. They pull in the apartment complex. Casey points to a unit. The cop gets out. He approaches the unit, knocks on the door. No answer, right? He sits there for a minute. No one's coming to the door. He doesn't hear anything inside. So he peeks inside and finds that the unit is completely vacant. Like, there's no furniture or anything. Nobody lives there. The police are frustrated, obviously. Like, time is very precious in a missing persons case, no less a missing child case. They continue their search efforts through the night, and then the cops go back to the apartment complex the next morning to speak with management, and that's when they learn that not only has no one lived in that specific unit for months now, but there was never even a tenant named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez at all in the apartment complex. complex. So just like that, the cops are back to square one. They confront Casey about this, but she sticks to her story that she left Kaylee with Zanny. Zanny was apparently a longtime nanny for Kaylee. She had been watching her since she was an infant. She was like, I swear I left Kaylee with Zanny, so we need to find Zanny. She also mentions that she had confided in a couple of her coworkers at Universal Studios about the situation. So now the cops are like, okay, well, let's go to Universal. Let's talk to your coworkers and see if they know anything. When they arrive at the park, Casey is showing them around. She's waving at employees. She shows them to the main office. When they make it to the office, Casey is leading them to talk with her supervisor, and they end up going down a dead-end hallway. And that's when Casey turns around and says, I don't actually work here. This was actually no surprise to police because they had been there already the day before and talked with her supervisor, and they discovered that she hadn't worked there in over 2 years. And also the names of the fellow co-workers that she apparently confided in, they were also non-existent. Are we seeing a pattern here? The police are like, yeah, we know you don't work here. How about we go back down to the station and you tell us what's really going on? Because at this point, they definitely have their suspicions about Casey's involvement, and they're hoping they can just get her to crack. Casey sticks to her story that she left Kaylee with Zanny the nanny. She has no idea where she is. She's also not showing any sense of urgency or upset at the situation. Like, she's just remaining completely calm. Obviously, this is very unusual behavior for someone that has not seen their daughter in 31 days and supposedly has no idea where they're at. Realizing that they're getting nowhere with Casey, they decide to arrest her on child neglect charges, hoping that maybe if they put her in jail, they'll get some kind of confession or information out of her. On July 16th, 2008, Casey is officially put under arrest for the child neglect charges, and her bail is set at $500,000. While Casey is in jail, she calls her mom, and Cindy is just pleading with Casey, like, please tell us where Kaylee is. We just want her home. We want her safe. We don't care what your involvement is, just tell us where she is so we can bring her home safely. And Casey just continues to stick with her story. Zanny the nanny has her. She has no idea where she is. She's, again, showing no sense of wanting to help, wanting to do anything. She's not crying. She's not a mess. She just keeps asking her mom for her boyfriend's phone number. Casey's boyfriend at the time was a guy named Tony Lazzaro, and police had not heard this name yet before. So as soon as Casey started asking for his phone number, they were like, okay, let's go pay Tony Lazzaro a visit. Tony was absolutely shocked to learn that Kaylee was missing. Casey had not mentioned a single word to him about not seeing her daughter in 31 days. Tony's roommate said that Casey used to bring Kaylee over 3 to 4 times a week, but as the month of June went on, he started seeing Kaylee less and less, and eventually it was just Casey coming over. Whenever anyone asked her where Kaylee was, she would just say that she was with her grandparents or she was with Zanny the nanny. Tony's roommate recalled spending quite a bit of time with Kaylee. He said that she was extremely bright and outgoing. She was super intelligent. She could count to 10 in English and in Spanish. She knew her shapes, and she was just always making everyone laugh. They all really enjoyed when Casey would bring Kaylee over. But when Casey said that she was leaving Kaylee with her grandparents or with Zanny the nanny, no one really questioned it. After speaking with Tony, the cops decide to take a closer look at the vehicle that Casey had been driving, and immediately upon opening the doors of the vehicle, they smelled the unmistakable smell of decomposition in the car. I have never smelled a dead body before, but everybody says that it's unmistakable. Like, you know that smell. It is completely different from anything you've ever smelled. They bring in a cadaver dog, and the dog hits on the trunk of the car. When they open up the trunk, they notice that that's definitely where the smell is originating. They also see a big stain in the back of the trunk, and the trunk looks to have been cleaned. They make note that the stain in the back of the trunk was roughly the size of a small child. So they take a sample of the carpet in the trunk, and they also collect a few hairs that they could find in the back, and they send that off for forensic testing. The evidence in the car, the smell coupled with the stain and the hairs in the back, make law enforcement realize that this car may have just taken a missing child investigation to a homicide investigation. At this point, police were still looking into the Zanny the nanny theory. I think they kind of knew it was bullshit, but they had to, formally rule it out. They do find a woman who lives about 20 minutes away named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. They call her in and ask her a few questions. This woman had no idea who Casey Anthony was. She didn't know who Kaylee was. She had never babysat for the Anthony family. This woman was also in her mid-50s, and Casey had said that Zanny the nanny was a young girl in her mid-20s. This just kind of confirmed what they already knew, that Zanny the nanny was knows another non-existent person. And they're getting real sick of Casey's shit. The community really came together in this time. They put together a 4,200 person search party, and they searched for 4 weeks straight, but unfortunately didn't find anything and were starting to lose hope. But the police hadn't lost hope just yet. They had gotten those testing results back from the sample of the carpet and the hair strands. It was concluded that there was sufficient evidence to believe that there was a decomposing body in the back of Casey's trunk. After getting these results, they really start putting together a case for first-degree murder. Casey was lucky enough to make bond back in August, but it's now October and she is being indicted for first-degree murder. By now, this case has been all over the nation. The public was absolutely outraged at Casey's callous behavior. Just didn't believe her behavior was one of a grieving mother missing her child. She seemed like she was totally disconnected. On December 11th, 2008, a utility worker in the area was working in some woods nearby when he spots something that looks a little unusual. So he approaches it. As he approaches it, he was horrified to discover that it was a small human skull. So he immediately notifies the police. When the cops examined the scene, they confirmed that the utility worker did in fact find a small human skull. They also see a bunch of other remains kind of scattered throughout the area. Some were still in black trash bags and others were just kind of like out in the vegetation. There was a Winnie the Pooh blanket nearby, as well as like a canvas type bag. And of course, based on the size of the remains, you know, it looks like remains of a small child. They're thinking that these are Caylee Anthony's remains that they found. They'll have to get them tested to be sure. But keep in mind, it's been about 6 months since Caylee was last seen. She went missing in June. It's now December. So these remains have been exposed to the elements. You know, this is in Florida, so it's hot, it's humid, it's rainy. There's animals in the woods that could have, you know, kind of scattered the remains about. There was no soft tissue left at all, and there was also no obvious signs of trauma to the bones. So determining a cause of death was going to be very difficult. Oh, and one other important detail, these remains were found a quarter of a mile from the Anthony family home. Dr. Jan G. was the medical examiner on the case, and she confirmed that yes, these are Caylee Anthony's remains, and her conclusion of the manner of death was homicide. Police get a warrant for the Anthony family home, and they find that Caylee's room had a Winnie the Pooh theme, hence the blanket at the crime scene. They also discover a second canvas bag that matches the one that was found at the crime scene. They were able to figure out that these specific canvas bags from the manufacturer were only sold in pairs, and so one of them was at the house, the other one was at the crime scene. As the prosecution is preparing for the trial, they realize because of how sensationalized this case has become, it's going to be almost impossible to find an impartial jury in the Orlando County. Rather than moving the entire trial out of the county, the judge decides to bring jurors in from outside the county. Casey had secured a man named Jose Baez as her attorney. The prosecution didn't have great things to say about Jose Baez, but they were kind of hoping it would work out in their favor because Jose didn't have a lot of court experience, so they were thinking that he was way in over his head with this case. Right off the bat with opening statements, Jose Baez drops a huge bombshell on the jury. He claims that Caylee Anthony died of accidental drowning by falling in the family's pool, and Casey just panicked. He says that George was home at the time, and George actually took it upon himself to dispose of Caylee's body in the woods nearby. Basically, he's saying Casey had nothing to do with the actual disposal of Caylee's remains. And Jose was not done with the bombshells just yet. He also explains to the jury that George had actually been sexually abusing Casey since she was 8 years old, and Casey has had to put on a front and lie about it since she was 8 years old, and that was Jose's way of explaining why Casey lied about all these different things throughout, you know, the investigation, was because she was trying to cover up for her dad like she's been doing her entire life. This was literally the first anyone in the Anthony family had heard these accusations against George, so it was just completely wild and out of left field. When George was questioned, he denied any involvement in Caylee's death or the disposal. He also denied all sexual abuse claims against him. Back in January of 2009, George had actually tried to commit suicide. He just was really struggling with the death of his granddaughter. He wrote a suicide letter explaining that he wanted to go be with Caylee, and the defense took this as an admission of guilt, when in reality, George had just lost his granddaughter and they found her in the woods nearby his home in a horrific way. I think anyone would have a hard time coping with that. And I know it's the defense's job to poke holes in stories and create their own narrative, but my God, I really feel like George took the brunt of this entire trial. It just seems incredibly disrespectful to George, knowing what he's been through, and frankly to Kaylee as well. And now it's the prosecution's turn to unveil all of their evidence. They had Dr. Voss do the forensic testing on the carpet sample from Casey's car, and he explained that there was an unusually high amount of chloroform present. He explains that with decomposing bodies, they can emit small amounts of chloroform, but the amount that was found in the trunk of the car was way above that normal threshold. The prosecution also mentioned that they had discovered some interesting search histories on the Anthony family computer. Someone had been searching for the word chloroform, and also a Google search for quote unquote how to make your own chloroform. The hair samples were determined to be Kaylee's as well. We used mitochondrial DNA to discover this. Basically, it could have been Cindy's, Casey's, or Kaylee's, obviously. But because the hair was untreated, aka like it wasn't dyed, it wasn't highlighted, they knew that it had to be Kaylee's because Casey had dyed hair and so had Cindy. There was also a dark band on the root of the hair that appears in decomposing bodies. They also brought up that there was some duct tape found at the scene. The medical examiner concluded that there was some type of like duct tape residue left on the mandible of Kaylee's skull. The medical examiner also explained that Kaylee's mandible and her skull were completely intact, which was highly unusual because there's not really any bones connecting your mandible to your skull, so usually those separate. Her theory was that Casey's mouth had been duct taped and it just was left like that as she decomposed, and that's why her mandible and her skull were able to stay intact. To the medical examiner, the duct tape and the way that Kaylee's body was disposed of, how it was left in trash bags in the woods, those two things coupled together clearly stated that this was a homicide to her. The prosecution presents their theory of what happened that night on June 16th. They say that Casey either obtains chloroform or she makes her own. She uses it to knock Kaylee out, and then she places duct tape over her mouth and her nose so that she can't breathe, basically to suffocate her, wraps her in her Winnie the Pooh blanket, places her in the trunk, and then she drives to her boyfriend's house with her dead 2-year-old in the trunk. And then the following night, she disposes of Kaylee in the woods near the Anthony family home. In the 31 days following Kaylee's disappearance, Casey is just out living her best 22-year-old life. Her boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro, at the time was a DJ, so she was, going to all his events, going out to the clubs. There's pictures of her dancing, drinking, just having a grand old time. Meanwhile, she hasn't seen her daughter in 31 days. She never once mentioned to anyone that Kaylee was missing or that she hadn't seen her in days. She just was living her life being completely carefree. And the icing on the cake was a tattoo artist that came forward and said that he tattooed Casey Anthony, and he gave her a tattoo that said Bella Vita, which translates to beautiful life. So in those weeks that her daughter was missing, she literally went and got a tattoo that says beautiful life. So now the defense takes over, and basically all they can do is try to create reasonable doubt in the jury's minds. Jose Baez calls Cindy Anthony to the stand, and he asks her to explain the chloroform searches on their family computer. Cindy explains that one of her pets had been eating bamboo leaves, and so she was trying to Google chlorophyll, but sometimes search engines will auto-populate, so it auto-populated to chloroform, and she didn't realize that she had searched for that. But that does not explain the search for how to make your own chloroform. So Cindy pretty much took responsibility for those chloroform searches on the family computer, even though the prosecution had Cindy's work history from that day, and her work log shows her being at work at the time that the searches were made. She still says, no, I made those searches. If they were on the computer, I made them. Okay, Cindy. They also had a second autopsy done on Kaylee's remains, and this medical examiner said that he would not rule this as a homicide. He said the duct tape should not even be included into the equation because there was no DNA found on the front or the back of the duct tape. Basically, he said if it had been placed on Kaylee's face, Kaylee's DNA would be on the back of it, and whoever placed it on her, their DNA would be on the front of it. But also we have to remember this tape was exposed to the elements out in the woods for 6 months. So how much DNA would actually be left on that realistically? Jose calls a plethora of witnesses to the stand. Everyone testifies on Casey's behalf that she was a good mom and they never saw any signs of neglect from her. Jose never once again brought up the sexual abuse claims against George. There was no explanation to that. It was just like a bombshell he dropped at the beginning of the case, and then it was never revisited, nor was he able to provide any evidence of Kaylee accidentally drowning like he proposed. There was no evidence for either of these claims, yet they were still allowed to be considered in court and be considered a part of the jury's decision. On July 5th, 2011, the trial ends and Casey Anthony's fate is in the hands of the jurors. They deliberate for roughly 11 hours before coming back with their verdict. The verdict is read aloud to the court. Casey Anthony was found not guilty on charges of first-degree murder, not guilty on charges of aggravated manslaughter, and not guilty of child abuse. They, for some reason, believed she was accountable for nothing. She was only found guilty on 4 misdemeanors, which were all related to her lying to police during the investigation. For each misdemeanor, she was to serve a year for each, so 4 years in total, but she got credit for time served, and she had already served about 3 years at this point, and she got credit for good behavior. So Casey Anthony went back to prison for 10 additional days. 10 days. And then she was released on July 17th, 2011. They just let her out in the world. Everyone was outraged. Even the judge himself said that he was baffled at the outcome, and he had to read the verdict twice to make sure that he was seeing what he was actually seeing. The jurors felt that the prosecution didn't provide enough concrete evidence against Casey, and they just didn't feel right. The prosecution did have, a lot of circumstantial evidence, and they even had the physical evidence, but the jury felt like they didn't have that definitive link between the evidence and Casey Anthony. Casey may have gotten away with murder, but she did not stay out of the headlines for very long. A private investigator that worked for Casey Anthony's defense team released some documents to the public that were very shocking. These documents entailed details about Casey and her attorney, Jose Baez, having a sexual relationship. Casey actually confessed that she was paying her legal fees to Jose Baez with sexual favors. But that wasn't all. These documents also entailed that Casey had actually admitted to Jose Baez that she did kill Kaylee, and Jose was the one who came up with the narrative that Kaylee accidentally drowned. Apparently, Jose had seen a picture of the Anthony family backyard, and he noticed that on the day that Kaylee died, a stepladder had been left into the pool, and so he decided to use that to their advantage, and he came up with this theory that Kaylee walked up the ladder and got in the pool and accidentally drowned. But of course, Jose Baez denied all claims. Cindy Anthony said that she first heard the accidental drowning theory from Jose Baez himself, not even from Casey, and Cindy truly believes that that is what happened. She thinks that Kaylee accidentally drowned, and Casey panicked and collected her body and dumped it in the woods nearby. George, on the other hand, has some damn common sense, and he says that the drowning theory is absolute bullshit. And I'm right there with you, George. He wants his daughter behind bars, paying for the pain and suffering that he and his wife have been through. He feels like there has been no justice for Kaylee. George and Cindy are still together despite their differing theories on what happened to Kaylee. George says he has no relationship with his daughter, and he has no intention of ever rekindling a relationship with her, but Cindy says she remains in contact periodically with Casey. I think the general consensus is Cindy really couldn't cope or even conceptualize that Casey could have killed her own daughter. In Cindy's mind, instead of losing her granddaughter and her daughter, I think she wanted to protect her daughter and keep the one person that she had left. Kaylee may have only been 2.5 years old, but she made waves. Because of her, Florida passed a law called Kaylee's Law that states if any parent or guardian does not report their child missing within 24 hours, then they can face felony charges. Because of Kaylee, we have this new law that will hopefully work to prevent what happened to her from happening to other children. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever know what actually happened that night in June of 2005, but I think we can all pretty much agree on what happened. Casey still maintains to this day that she was wrongfully accused, and apparently she's working on writing a book detailing her experience of being wrongfully accused. No one cares, Casey. No one wants to read your fictionalized version of what happened that night. You can't believe a word that comes out of this woman's mouth. Kaylee would be 17 years old today. She would be graduating high school, learning how to drive, possibly even working her first job, but all of that was taken from her. And I know that her grandparents, Cindy and George, still think about her every day and miss her dearly. And that is it, you guys. It's very tragic, very sad, very infuriating above all else. But that is it, and I will see you guys very soon in a new true crime dish. Bye, guys.